Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Fry, and today we are going to be talking a little bit about the ETR, IEP, and 504 plans. I am the Growth Ambassador and Clinical Director for Gym City Behavior Solutions. I have been working in the field of special education for over 17 years now. And I also have a background in special education from a personal point, as I had an IEP when I was a child and throughout high school. And then I also had accommodations for when I was in college. And I have a doctorate now in education. So I've been through this process on both sides. And if you don't know this information, it's very hard to navigate through the system. So this is our hope for today, is that you'll be able to understand the differences between an ETR, an IEP, and a 504 plan, and to explore the eligibility criteria for each type of this plan, and to discuss the roles of different stakeholders in that process. So just to start off with, there are some differences between an ETR, an IEP, and a 504. An ETR is an evaluation team report. It's an initial assessment used to determine students' eligibility for special education services. An IEP is an individual education program, a legal document developed for students with disabilities requiring specialized instruction guided by the results of that ETR. A 504 plan is a plan that involves accommodations for students with disabilities but does not require specialized instruction. And we'll get into the differences between these as we move forward. ETR, it all starts with an evaluation. One of the most common misconceptions is that a medical diagnosis automatically qualifies a student for an IEP or special education services. A medical diagnosis does not necessarily mean that the student has an educational disability. A medical diagnosis deals with a person's mental and physical health or their development. An educational disability pertains to the student's ability to progress in the general education classroom. There is a set of criteria that must be met for the medical diagnosis. This is also the same for educational disability. There is a specific set of criteria that must be met. Just because someone has a medical diagnosis does not automatically mean that they will qualify for special education services. It must adversely impact them in such a way that requires specially designed instruction. An educational disability is determined through the results of a multifactored evaluation and a team of individuals, including the parents, guardians of the student. This sometimes is difficult for families, especially if they have been given a medical diagnosis and then they go to the school and they say, well, we've got a medical diagnosis. We need to have some specially designed instruction. Well, we need to determine that first. And so there are some disability categories to be able to get special education services through an IEP. There are several disability categories here. There's 13 actually. The federal law, IDEA, and the state of Ohio provides a definition for each of the disability categories. If you'd like to know more about these disability categories or more about the ETR process, we do have another video that specifically discusses ETRs and how to go through that process in great detail. I highly recommend checking out that video and then coming back to this one. The criteria is different from criteria used in medical diagnosis fields because it is measuring the impact of the student's education. Definitions are written by the Ohio Administrative Code and can be found in operating standards for education of children with disabilities. It's important to note that there are some definitions to these diagnoses, such as significantly affecting, having severe communication needs, and over a long period of time, marked to a certain degree. These are certain benchmarks that require special education services. In general, there must be a significant difference between the student being evaluated and their peers. So if we look at this bell curve here, We have sometimes it's helpful to have this imagery. We have a average range, which is at the top. You have a below average, and you have low, and you have extremely low. So when they are looking at this, they are looking for 2 standard deviations below the mean, and that is where you're going to find where individuals are significantly impacted. And so this visual just allows you to see that there might be individuals who have a diagnosis that are maybe performing a little bit below average, but they're not significantly or extremely low, which would require an intervention of some sort or specially designed instruction. The evaluation will use a standardized testing and have norms. Students with educational disability will generally fall in the low or extremely low range. Other terminology that might be used would be moderately delayed or severely delayed. Requesting an evaluation for educational services. The request to evaluate can be made by either the district or the parent. In either situation, the parent must sign a consent for the evaluation. It's very important to do this. This way they can start this process. There is a timeline that's associated with all of this. And so once you sign that consent form and have requested for that, that timeline begins. And that's when they need to start the evaluation process. The process begins when someone, typically a teacher, parent, or school staff, makes a referral for the evaluation. Parents can also make formal written requests for the evaluation if they suspect their child has disability. It's important to bring that information to the district, have lots of data collection that you've had as a parent, any other information that might help in determining whether your child would be applicable for specially designed instruction. Once the referral is made, the school gets that written consent, and then that's when the process starts. So there will be a multi-factored evaluation. This section will summarize the student's strengths and identify needs based on the evaluator's assessment. This section should include information such as their current skills and functioning levels, indicate any difficulties the student may have accessing or making progress in the general education curriculum, be in language that is understandable to all team members, including the parent, provide direction for access in the general education curriculum. The implications for instruction and progress monitoring is all a part of this as well. So each evaluator will have background information, the observations of the student, interpretation of any assessment given as part of the evaluation, a description of their educational needs, and the implications for instructing and progress monitoring. In that section, it provides a summary of proposed supports and services to address the child's educational and functional needs. It should be individualized to the student specifically. This section should not contain predetermination, but instead recommendations. You might see words such as may benefit, might or might need. Remember, it's up to the entire disciplinary team to determine whether or not a student meets the definition and criteria of an educational disability. And then this brings us to the evaluation team meeting. Depending on the number of areas evaluated, there could be quite a few people in attendance for this meeting. The evaluation process is typically carried out by a multidisciplinary team that includes several key individuals. So you may have a school psychologist in there who conducts cognitive and psychological assessments. You might have your special education teacher, which assesses the student's academic performance, functional skills, and how the suspected disability impacts classroom learning. You'll have a general education teacher who provides insights into how the student's performance in the general education classroom. Parents and guardians, of course, they offer valuable input. You are the expert in your child, and so you're going to bring a lot of great information to that meeting. There may be other specialties as well, depending on the suspected disability. It includes a speech and language pathologist, possibly an OT, maybe even a physical therapist, could have a behavior specialist or a BCBA, or a medical professional, especially if there is medical aspects of the child's condition. So maybe they have ADHD and they have seizures. So that would be an important person to provide feedback for that as well. The team will review and report together and discuss those results. And then we get into the eligibility determination. The team can only choose from one disability category, even if it may fit into multiple categories. So this is really important. They can only select one. So your child may have dual diagnoses, but they're going to find the category that best meets your child's current needs. The team will only consider the disability category listed on the planning form. The determination of no disability doesn't mean that your child doesn't have a medical diagnosis. It means that according to the testing, their disability does not impact them to the point that they may require specially designed instruction or that they are able to make adequate progress in the general education curriculum. Often, school districts may suggest a 504 plan for those students who have a medical diagnosis but don't qualify for special education services. As they go through this report, they're going to talk about all the different testing that had been completed, what the results of those testing were, and any other important information. At the end, they're going to determine what category, if they are eligible for special education services, and then they will list what that eligibility category is. Now, as a parent, you are not required to sign the report at the meeting. You can review that information, especially if you have concerns that maybe that is not the right diagnosis for your eligibility category for your child. So you can carefully consider the report and to see if you agree that that's an accurate representation of your child. The team, including parents, they'll meet to review those results of the evaluation, and that will determine the eligibility for services. The findings are discussed, and then, of course, the parents are a very important aspect of this process because everybody wants to be on the same page. It is a team of professionals that are working to support your child, and so it's helpful to make sure that they know your child well and that you are giving them all the information they need. Now, what to do if the determination is no disability? If the team determines that the student does not have a disability after completing the evaluation process, there are several key outcomes to discuss. So one is you want to discuss the results of the evaluation. The evaluation results may be shared with parents and all those that are involved. The findings will indicate that the student does not meet the criteria for special education services under IDEA, which again is Individuals with Disability Education Act, or Section 504. So then they'll look at general education supports for that child to see if there is a response to intervention to support that child. They'll do monitoring and reevaluation to make sure that the different accommodations that they're making are truly meeting that child's needs. As a parent, you have rights. You have a right to appeal the decision if you disagree with that. The school will provide information about the appeal process and parental rights under IDEA in Section 504. You can continue to collaborate with the school team and then review of instructional practices. Just because there's a determination of no disability does not mean that you cannot access potentially a 504 plan or continue to monitor. And if we see that there is progress is not being made, then they can go back and reevaluate. It's not that is the end of the line for that child's educational career. So let's say that there is, they do qualify. They have been able to determine that child does meet the eligibility categories. They were able to say yes, that the determining factor for the child's poor performance is not due to a lack of appropriate instruction in reading or math or limited English proficiency. The child meets the state criteria for having a disability based on the data and documented, and that the child has demonstrated an educational need that requires significantly designed instruction. So if a yes was answered to all three of those questions, then that child would fit the eligibility criteria for an IEP, and then we would move into the IEP process. All right. So we'll do a quick overview of what an IEP is. So it's governed by IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disability Education Act. It provides specialized instruction. It focuses on ensuring FAPE, which is free, appropriate public education. It includes specific educational goals and services. There might be some common services such as speech and OT and academic modifications. In Ohio, IEPs are developed in line with both IDEA and Ohio Administrative Code. And Ohio schools must follow the state procedural safeguards for special education. So what does all that mean? So it's governed by Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is a federal law that ensures that students with a disability receive access to necessary supports. IDEA requires schools to provide specialized instruction and related services to meet the unique needs of the student qualifying disabilities. Specialized instruction for those students, they have such as having like a learning disability, autism, or speech impairments, receive customized educational plans. These plans ensure that the students have the support they need to succeed in the classroom and make academic progress. So if we're looking at FAPE, which is free, appropriate public education, that means that all students with disabilities have the right to access education that meets their individual needs at no cost to the family. FAPE ensures that students receive services that allow them to make meaningful progress in school and life. Now, moving on to the goals and services. So in the IEP, it's tailored to address the specific learning needs of that child. Each IEP is going to include specific goals and objectives and services designed to help to make that student make progress. In the IEP, there could be a recommendation for so many minutes of speech or occupational therapy or specific academic modifications. So let's say they might need twice the amount of time on their test. They might have somebody scribe for them. Somebody might read them the test. There are modifications that can be made. And then these services are provided by qualified professionals to ensure that the student receives the targeted interventions. So you'll see when you have an IEP, there's going to be a section where they are talking about who's providing what services. It's going to list how many minutes they get and who is going to be providing that service and what goal that is related to. So Ohio-specific IEP requirements. IEPs must be developed in accordance, as we mentioned before, with IDEA and Ohio Administrative Code, ensuring compliance with both federal and state regulations. The OAC outlines additional procedure requirements that Ohio schools must follow when creating and implementing an IEP. So you'll see that they'll set up a parent meeting. They might send you a prior written notice. They want you to sign these things. They're going to ask you if you have your procedural safeguard pamphlet or booklet rather, to make sure that they're checking all their boxes because they have to follow the federal and state law to make sure that they're doing everything on their end. And school districts are audited to make sure that these things are occurring as they should. In Ohio, schools are required to give the procedural safeguards, as I mentioned, which is a nice booklet that tells you what your rights are. They are required to give you that at every meeting if you want it. They do sometimes update those. It is quite a hefty little booklet, but it is important to look because it gives you what all your rights and procedures to do if you feel that something is in violation of your child's IEP or in violation of the Ohio Administrative Code. These are safeguards ensure that parents are informed and involved in decisions related to their child's education, including the right to challenge or appeal decisions if necessary. Something I tell families is if you're doing an IEP and you're reviewing that IEP and maybe you don't feel like that's an accurate representation of your child or that you're not necessarily happy with that goal, it is a fluid document, so you can always go back and modify, but you don't have to sign it at that time. You can sit and discuss more. It's important that you know what your rights are and that be able to make modifications when needed. School districts are really good about listening and hearing what you have to say so that they can get changes made and to make sure that we've met the needs of the child. And that's a section that they'll go through in the IEP where they'll ask you, did we consider all these different things? And the whole team has to agree to that. So if you don't agree to that, you do not have to sign that. There's also a part of it where it says, I do not agree to this IEP, or the changes made for maybe there's a change of placement or something along those lines. You can always go back through and make modifications. You can amend an IEP. I've had kids who just made a lot of progress in a half of a year. And so those goals were mastered and they needed something different. So we went back through and we modified that IEP to reflect the new goals and the progress that they had made. And vice versa. I've had clients that had some setbacks due to some other things that occurred, and their IEP needed to have some modifications or they needed to have some additional accommodations to better meet their needs. And there's a lot more that we could talk about with IEPs. We could break down each section. But today I really wanted to give you an overview of what an IEP is versus a 504. We could go on for a very long time about all the different sections of an IEP. They try to take in consideration the background, all the evaluations, all those different parts. You get into the goals, and then you get into what will they be receiving their services in a general ed classroom, and especially least restrictive environment. There's a lot of different aspects to it, including if they're 14, there is a whole section related to transitional planning where we'll get into additional goals for that. There is a lot to the IEP process, but this is an overview of IEPs and 504s. So moving on to 504 plans. Again, we're going to start with an overview. So 504 plans are governed by Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So that's a big difference between an IEP and a 504 plan. They provide accommodations for students with disabilities. They ensure access to the general education, focuses on preventing discrimination. They have common accommodations can include extended test time, assistive technology. Again, 504 is in compliance and overseen by the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce. And Ohio schools must ensure that students with disabilities receive accommodations without discrimination. So again, a big difference is that Section 504 is a federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in programs and activities that receive federal funding, and that includes public schools. It ensures that students with disabilities have equal access to education and opportunities provided for their non-disabled peers. They provide accommodations to students with disabilities to support their participation in the general education setting. So that's an important aspect of this. This is not, they're not pulled out into another classroom. This is all occurring in the general education setting. These accommodations are designed to remove barriers and allow students access to the same educational opportunities as their peers. Unlike an IEP, which may involve specially designed instruction, Section 504 plans focus on providing accommodations that allow students to access the general education curriculum. It ensures that they can participate in regular classroom environment alongside their peers with appropriate supports in place. The primary goal of a 504 plan is to prevent discrimination against students with disabilities. The schools are required to ensure that the students are not included or denied benefits of programs, services, or activities simply based on their disability. Accommodations for a 504 plan might include, like we mentioned before, extended test time, assistive technology such as screen readers, speech-to-text programs, or adaptive devices to aid learning. They might have different seating arrangements or modified class schedules to support that student's unique needs. Again, these are accommodations. This is not changing any of the general education. They're still accessing the same curriculum in the same way. It is not modified from what their peers are receiving. Ohio is again in compliance with Section 504 as seen by the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce. They have to meet both federal and state standards to guarantee students with disabilities receive appropriate accommodations without discrimination. Ohio schools are legally required to provide these accommodations to students with disabilities and ensure that they're treated equally and fairly. And those items would be outlined in your 504 plan. This includes ensuring that the disability is not the reason for denial of access to educational supports, opportunities, or activities. So I have a little visual here, which I think helps because a lot of times there's a lot of confusion between an IEP versus a 504. What do you get with an IEP? What do you get with a 504? So looking at this, one in the middle there, both parents need to consent to have the child evaluated. It's no cost to parents for these services. It works to meet the needs of the person receiving the plan. So that's both of them. That's the hope for these plans here. An IEP is required because of IDEA, which is an educational law, whereas a 504 is required because of the Rehabilitation Act, which is a civil rights law. An IEP provides specially designed instruction, whereas a 504 provides accommodations. An IEP focuses on what the student is learning, whereas a 504 focuses on how the student is learning. The states receive additional funding for eligible students. In a 504, the states do not receive additional funding for that. In an IEP, a person must have one or more of the 13 listed disabilities. In a 504, a person can have any disability. So this is just I thought it was a nice visual of being able to break down similarities and differences between those. So going into the eligibility differences. 504 plans are designed for students whose disabilities significantly affect a major life function, such as learning, walking, or breathing, but do not require specialized instruction. The focus of a 504 plan is to provide accommodations and modifications that allow the student to access the general education environment and participate alongside their peers. IEP, an IEP is for students with one of the 13 specific disabilities. And this can include learning disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, and others. Again, it's those 13 listed categories that we mentioned at the beginning. Unlike a 504 plan, though, an IEP provides specialized instruction and related services such as speech or occupational therapy, tailored to the student's unique needs. A 504 plan are commonly used for students with health conditions such as asthma, diabetes, ADHD, or anxiety, where accommodations are needed to manage their condition and support their ability to learn. These students may need adjustments, like we mentioned before, extra test time, access to medication, seating accommodations, etc. Again, but those are not specially designed instruction. They're going to address their specific learning needs and allows them to make meaningful academic progress. Oh, I lost one of my notes here. In a 504 plan, it follows federal guidelines for Section 504, ensuring that students with disabilities receive those accommodations. Schools are required to ensure that the student receives the appropriate modifications and meet their educational needs. Ohio aligns with IDEA for IEPs and those specific learning categories, and these categories guide the process for determining whether a student qualifies for that. That was that ETR. So differences in services. A 504 focuses on those accommodations, whereas an IEP focuses on providing that and specially designed instruction. An IEP also includes that transitional planning time that starts at age 14, which we mentioned briefly. In Ohio, those IEPs with the transitional planning start at age 14 to help students prepare for their life after high school, whether that's higher education, employment, or independent living. So you're going to see goals in those areas related to that. A transitional plan provides those specific goals and services that will help that student develop skills necessary for that post-secondary life. So it's really important that they learn those vocational training, self-advocacy, and life skills for education. If your child will be turning age 14 within the time that an IEP is effective, they will do the transitional period even if they're 13 at that age, because they'll be transitioning, they'll be turning 14, and then you'll need that transitional plan there. Some important things to note timeline-wise: an ETR is completed every 3 years. That's your evaluation. The ETR guides the IEP. An IEP is completed every year. And so depending on when that evaluation was done and when they started the IEP, that will be the date the day before. That next year is when that IEP will be due. Review and documentation. So a 504 plan is less formal than an IEP. It is reviewed. It reviews schedules is based on the student's need rather than an annual requirement. The primary focus of a 504 plan is providing those accommodations. Reviews are conducted as needed based on the student's progress or any changes in their condition. An IEP is definitely more formal. It's reviewed annually, includes specific goals and benchmarks. There's also progress reporting on that. Every quarter, it's required to report on how that child is performing in those goals and objectives. And have proper documentation. How are you going to be documenting that progress? Whether it's through observation, running record, checklists, etc. There's different ways that they can collect that data. The IEPs are reviewed annually by the IEP team, which the parents, teachers, and any other school personnel, to ensure that the child's goals are being met and adjustments are being made as needed. This also keeps a requirement that the schools must take data collection, must show how they are meeting the needs of this child in those specific areas. It's also important to make sure that they're getting the minutes that have been given to them for those related services or those special individuals. If your child is not getting those minutes, then the school district would be required to make those minutes up for you, whether that's through an outside provider or providing additional services during the summer, what have you. And on an IEP as well, they might determine eligibility for extended school year services. So that is really determined about whether the child has lost skills over the summer and has not been able to recoup those skills. It doesn't necessarily have to be over the summer. It could be any kind of extended break. And if the child is not able to recoup those skills in a reasonable amount of time, then that child may be eligible for extended school year services, which would outline how many days or hours they would need in the summer to be able to keep them up to date and make sure those skills are not lost. But that is determined through the IEP team as well. Formal documentation, both IEPs and 504 plans require some formal documentation and need to be reviewed. But like we mentioned before, 504 plans, they're not reviewed every year. It's as needed, whereas an IEP is very specifically reviewed. Parents are key members of the team and have the right to participate in all meetings, reviews, and decisions regarding their child. For IEPs, parent consent is required for the initial implementation, and parents have the right to request revisions or reevaluations for both IEP and 504 plans. So I get this question a lot. Which is better? And it's difficult to be able to decide, what is best. Well, we're going to base this on the evaluation that's determining whether that child needs an IEP or that they would be better suited for a 504 plan. And I have seen kids transition from one or the other, just related on how they were progressing. Typically what I've seen is some kids that are on a 504 plan that transition into an IEP when those accommodations were not necessarily working for them, or they had some major changes in their life that required them to have higher levels of support and some specially designed instruction. Choosing between a 504 plan and an IEP really just depends on the child's needs. The decision is to implement a 504 or an IEP is how is the student and how is their disability affecting their learning and access to a curriculum? Is the student requiring accommodations to participate in general education, or do they truly need to have that instruction completely changed in some way to address more significant learning challenges? An IEP is appropriate for students who need that specially designed instruction. And again, they may need related services. So if they need those related services, a IEP is going to be a better route for them. And a 504 plan, it might be sufficient for students just needing accommodations. Maybe they just needed that extra test time or somebody to scribe for them or somebody to read to them. They understand the material. They're able to be successful with those simple modifications. In Ohio, all plans must align with what the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce regulations and guidelines. I will say that, again, the school districts do receive money for clients that are students that are on an IEP, and that is to help provide those services because it does cost more to support those students. You need to have a variety of professionals to do that. Whereas a 504 plan, they do not receive any federal funding for that. So those are going to be pretty easy accommodations to be made that is not as expensive as what those specially designed instruction and related services may be. Now, I have a sheet here that I think is very helpful. It's an IEP versus a 504 plan. I got this from Understood for All webpage. They have some great information on there. I recommend. They have a nice little video that summarizes everything that we talked about in a much briefer context. So if looking at this, it's going to ask some questions, and then it has an IEP and 504 plan. And it really gives a nice breakdown of what it is, which law it's covered, what's in the plan, how does the plan track progress. And so I think one of the important things to note here is that how an IEP tracks progress is they have those quarterly assessments where they are noting what benchmarks they're meeting and progress reporting that every quarter. Whereas a 504 plan doesn't track progress or include annual goals because that would just be tracked through their grading system that the school typically does. It reads about who can get a plan, which we discussed, and who creates a plan. So the team that creates an IEP must include the student, parent, or caregiver, at least one general education teacher, at least one special education teacher, a school psychologist or other specialist who can interpret the evaluation results or other data, a district representative who has the power to approve school resources for that student. The rules for who can create a 504 plan are less specific than an IEP. The team that creates that plan may include the student's parent or caregiver, a general or special education teacher, and the school principal. And this sheet goes through when is the parent's consent required. That's required across both. How often is the plan reviewed? We talked about that with the IEP versus the 504. The rules for that can vary by state, but generally a 504 is reviewed each year and reevaluation is done every 3 years or when needed. When are families notified about changes? Well, with an IEP, the school has to tell the families in writing before the IEP team meets to make any changes to the IEP. That's really important. In a 504, the school has to tell families about significant change, and I think that's important terminology to the 504 plan. Many schools will send a written notification for that. And then how do we go about when there are disagreements, disputes? So families with an IEP have several dispute resolution options, ranging from talking with the school all the way up to filing a lawsuit or a civil rights complaint. Ohio has some really great mediators and other means to help facilitate in an IEP meeting. Well, it's very rare to have an IEP meeting that there's major disputes that would require other individuals to be involved. I have been in some of those IEP meetings, probably more than what I care to say, but that's usually because there is a concern about how that child is receiving that service and where they're going to receive that service. So it could be that the parents are pushing for an alternate placement because they feel that the district does not have adequate resources for their child, even with the IEP in place. And so in those cases, I've worked with a mediator that comes in. They're fantastic. They help explain both sides and get to a resolution so that everybody is happy with where they are with the IEP, and it's reflecting the needs of that student, and that student's needs are being met. I've also worked with that where we had a mediator and a support person from the Ohio Coalition come out and support because the family felt that the child would do better with an IEP as opposed to a 504 plan, and they wanted to have a reevaluation completed. And so they had a parent advocate come in and help assist with that as well. And then once that was completed, then there was no need for mediation. Everybody agreed that the child did qualify for an IEP, and we were able to kind of move forward. I have had other disputes where a child came from a different state, and on that IEP listed very specific services, and it happened that that school district had adopted that IEP without fully going back through and looking at what those accommodations and specific individuals that were providing that service. Because not all school districts have all the same service providers. So, for example, I'm a board-certified behavior analyst, and not all school districts have one on staff. But some states do, and this particular child was coming from a state in which a BCBA provided so many minutes of their services. And when the school district adopted that IEP, they did not have a BCBA to provide that service. So then they had to go back and give back all those minutes and recoup all those minutes, and they had to get an outside person, it was me, to go out there and get that taken care of. So that's times where you would see some disputes with that. Most of the time, these are very open conversations to make sure that everybody is meeting the needs of their child. I mentioned in the last presentation is that I have some families that will bring a picture of their child and set it on the table at the meeting so that everybody knows that this is who we're talking about. This is who we want to get their needs met. And it's just a nice reminder of what we're doing, because sometimes these meetings can be so formal and can be very scary for a parent going in, especially if it's just one parent and you have this team of 10 other people across the table from you telling you all these things. It can be very overwhelming. So I encourage parents, bring with you support people. You don't have to do that IEP alone. Anybody can go. Bring grandma. If grandma is an active part of your child's education, great. Bring your neighbor. Maybe your neighbor spends a lot of time with your child. Bring who you would want to help support that would provide adequate information on your child to better serve them. And that way you know that you're being supported. So in conclusion, both 504 and IEPs support students with disabilities. The choice depends on the student's individual needs. You're going to collaborate with education and specialists. It's crucial in determining what the best support system is. Any questions? Well, I really appreciate everybody's time today. This was a very quick snapshot of 504 versus IEP versus ETR. And as we move through these different presentations, there'll be more information with more detail on all the services that you can get. So please stay tuned to these videos and be on the lookout for the next one.